The gospel that Father Ehring just read describes one of the many different miracles that Jesus performed during his ministry. And all those miracles that he did and all the healings, the whole idea behind them was that he was taking something that was visible for people to see in order to lead them to faith in what they could not see, God. Faith is so important to us because it's that which gives us a relationship with God. We have to believe that he exists in order to have a relationship with him, to even begin one. And so faith is so important, and today I'd like to just talk a little bit about the Shroud of Turin and how I believe it can really strengthen us in our faith. Now, the Shroud of Turin is actually the single most studied artifact on the face of the planet. Nothing on Earth has been studied as much as the Shroud. There have been over 2,000 scientists, some with Nobel Prizes in their field of study, who have studied the Shroud and put in more than 600,000 hours of peer-reviewed research. And what they've found is, I think, truly amazing. Now, the first question that many of the scientists had when they went over to study the Shroud was, is it a fake? Is it a forgery? And a lot of the scientists were atheists, so they thought they could disprove the Shroud in just a few hours. But it turned out they were not able to do that. They conducted a test called a pyrolysis mass spectrometry test, and that can identify any organic or inorganic material or pigments known to mankind. And it can also identify its chemical composition. So when the scientists put the Shroud through that test, they found there was no organic and no inorganic material on the image part of the man of the Shroud. It means there were no pigments, no paints, no dyes, no stains, no spices, no oils, and no biochemicals known to be produced by the human body that could produce such an image. The scientists then put the Shroud through a VP8 3D image analyzer, which is a piece of equipment that NASA uses to map the topography of the moon and other planets. And whenever you put a two-dimensional image through that machine, it will always come out distorted, whether it's a picture or a painting or a drawing. Now, when they did this test with the Shroud, what came out from it was a perfect three-dimensional body. So the scientists say that's only possible if the Shroud was wrapped around an actual body when the image was produced. And the Shroud also has three-dimensional qualities encoded in the Shroud. They also concluded the image was not produced by scorching, because when you put scorch marks under ultraviolet light, the scorch marks will fluoresce, and the image does not fluoresce. They also concluded it's not a photograph because there's no light-sensitive photographic material found on the Shroud, which would have to be there in order for the linen to capture the image. And what was really puzzling to them is that the Shroud also is a bit of an X-ray. It has X-ray qualities, what they call being mechanically transparent. It means that you can see the bones in the hand, and they could see some teeth through a closed mouth, a couple of vertebrae, and some ribs. So in the end, science determined it's not a painting, it's not a scorching, it's not a photograph, it's not produced by vaporization or body chemicals, it's not manufactured, and it's not produced. So they don't know what it is exactly, but they do say it's not a fake and it's not a forgery. So then they took a closer look at, well, what actually happened to this man on the image on the Shroud? And they see that he was badly beaten around the face with a large swelling on the right side. The cartilage in his nose was separated. There are 30 to 50 puncture wounds around the head. He was scourged or whipped with a Roman-style whip. He carried something very heavy on his back because there are deep wounds and abrasions on his upper back. His chin, nose, and knees were badly torn, seemingly from falls that he was not able to avoid by bracing himself with his arms. The man on the shroud was also crucified, and no bones were broken, and a spear matching the dimensions of a Roman spear from 2,000 years ago pierced his heart. The bloodstains on the shroud are human, and they determined the blood was not placed or sprinkled on the shroud, but rather was the result of oozing out of real wounds. So the next question they had, well, where did all this take place? Where did the shroud come from? Is there any indication on the shroud of where its origin where it's from? And a criminologist from Switzerland, Dr. Max Frey, he took some samples and he found 58 different pollen species on the shroud. 45 are found in the Holy Land. 18 are found from plants that only grow in the Holy Land, and 3 are from plants that only grow in the Jerusalem area. Scientists also found soil in his nose, chin, knees, and feet. And they did a chemical composition of it, and they found that it was made of calcium carbonate with a touch of strontium, and its crystalline structure was classified as travertine aragonite. And they say that's kind of a rare combination, but they matched it perfectly to the soil samples from the grottos in Jerusalem. So the shroud was in the Jerusalem area. And when did all this take place? Well, you may have heard that in 1988, some scientists did some carbon-14 dating on the shroud. And they came back with the results saying it was dated from 1290 to 1360 AD, so it was impossible to be the shroud of Jesus Christ. But since that time, many other scientists have done more study on it, and now that 1988 result has been officially retracted. Oxford University was the first to publish that 1988 result, but in 2017 they officially published a retraction. And the reason is because of what science has found since 1988. Other scientists discovered that the cleaning of the sample that was taken from the shroud was done in such a way that it would not have removed the microscopic plastic coating-like that would have been on the fibrils due to the bacteria and the fungi. And that will throw off the carbon-14 dating. Russian scientists, they put similar linen like the shroud through fires, and then the linen that survived the fire they tested with carbon-14 dating testing, and they found that it throws off the carbon-14 by 700 to 1300 years. And we know the shroud was in 3 fires. Textile experts found that in the sample taken from the shroud, there was cotton and plant gum resin, but there was no cotton or plant gum resin in the rest of the shroud. Then they did a brightness map test, which can test the chemical composition of material. And they found that the image of the shroud, where it was tested, it produced a orange reddish glow, but the sample part produced a green kind of tree color, a forest green color. So they said that a little child could look at that result and say, look, Mommy, that part of the shroud is different from the other part. So for these reasons and other reasons, they've officially said those 1988 results are not valid for dating the shroud because it wasn't done properly, and they took a part of the sample that did not represent the whole shroud. And using that VP8 3D image analyzers, scientists found little button-shaped button-like shapes over the eyes. And then using a process called polarized image overlay, they identified those button shapes as Roman leptons, Roman coins. And leptons were minted by Tiberius Caesar between 29 and 32 AD. And in 2013, Professor Giulio Fanti from the engineering department at the University of Padua, he conducted a spectroscopy test on the shroud. And that measures the interaction of matter with electromagnetic radiation. And it can be used to identify the age of materials. And the results indicate, it gives a range, so the results indicate the shroud dates back to 280 BC to 220 AD. So right in the middle would be the time of Christ. So it seems that the shroud can be dated back to the time of Christ. And although Romans crucified tens of thousands of men, there are some unique qualities to this shroud that are utterly unique. For example, scientists tell us that the man on the shroud had his hair in a pigtail in the back. And that is how religious men, Jewish men, dedicated to prayer, would wear their hair. And they also found the image of a phylactery on his forehead. And a phylactery was a small wooden rectangular box with a piece of scroll inside it. And on the scroll was written the Shema, which is that part of Scripture that says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, and soul." And so religious Jewish men would strap that to their head while they were praying. And so it was obvious that this man was a Jewish man dedicated to prayer. Now, Romans would normally either condemn a man by scourging or by crucifixion. They wouldn't do both because scourging was so brutal, it would often just kill the man all by itself. But this man had both scourging and crucifixion. Romans did not normally crown crucified men with a crown of thorns. I mean, why would they bother? Unless maybe the man claimed to be a king. And when Romans wanted to make sure somebody was dead on the cross or speed up the process, they would take a wooden bat and break his legs. And then the man would not be able to support himself, and he would slump down and slump forward. And that would put pressure on his lungs, and he would be able to breathe less and less and less, and in a few moments, he wouldn't be able to breathe at all, and he would suffocate. But this man on the shroud had no broken bones, but his heart was speared with a Roman lance. Now, the final question to ask that I think just really blows me away is they took a look and said, well, okay, well, Jesus claimed to have risen from the dead. Is there any indication of something like that on the shroud? And what the scientists discovered was that ancient Jews, when they would weave a cloth like that, they would wash it in a weed kind of detergent. It would purify it, make it very bright and white, and act as a fungicide. So they did that, and then the scientists laid it out in the sun to dry, the way ancient Jews would, and they found afterwards that a very thin sugar carbohydrate layer would form on the fibers of the shroud, just 1/100th the diameter of a human hair. And so they're saying some power or some energy interacted with that layer to dehydrate and discolor the shroud, forming the image. And the interesting thing is they say that it had to have happened after this man was dead, because they already see that rigor mortis had set into the body, and that happens after death. And if the body would have been alive when he was speared in the heart, there would be swelling around the wound, but there's no swelling. So he was speared in his heart after he was already dead. Also, they see that the blood serum had separated from the blood, and that's evidence from around the heart area. And the way it works is kind of like our heart is about the size of a human fist, and it's pumping, pumping, pumping. But when it stops, what happens is the blood slowly begins to settle, and the red corpuscles, the thick part of the blood, settles on the bottom, and the plasma part, the watery part, stays on top. It separates. So if you were to spear that open, out would come what looks like blood and water. But that can only happen after the man has been dead for half an hour to an hour. And so they say this man was clearly dead when this image was made. However, it had to have happened before the fourth day. Because on the fourth day, the body begins to decompose, and there would be evidence of decomposition of cells on the shroud. They studied over 200 Egyptian mummies and their shrouds, and they all had decomposition on it. But this shroud had no decomposition. Plus, they did an interesting test called fibrinolysis. And that's a test where they somehow can tell how long the blood has been in contact with the body. And the test showed that the blood was only in contact with the body for 30 to 36 hours, and then the body was no longer there. And if you think Jesus was crucified or died around 3 o'clock on Good Friday, by the time they got permission from Pilate to take down the body, by the time they washed it and dressed it and wrapped it in a shroud, might have been 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon on Good Friday. Well, 30 hours later would be midnight on Easter Sunday morning, and 36 hours would be at 6 o'clock Sunday morning. So they're saying that somewhere between that time, the body was no longer in contact with the blood. It was no longer in the shroud. And the scientists say that the body was not unwrapped from the shroud, because if it was unwrapped, the blood would have smeared. But more importantly, the blood serum would have smeared, and that's invisible to the naked eye. You can only see it under ultraviolet light, and none of the blood serum is smeared. Also, there are no pressure points on the shroud, meaning that the body, they say, was weightless when this image happened. And also, it was mechanically transparent, which means like, are your stained glass windows here are mechanically transparent, meaning that light can pass through it. And so they're saying that the body shows, on the shroud, indications that the body passed through it. Because it's working like an X-ray, and they can see the bone structure and parts of the body. I just find these things amazing. Now, this is just what they're saying. They're not coming to any conclusions. They to this day cannot repeat it, even with modern technology. There was a scientist, a physicist, for 5 years. He used micro lasers trying to reproduce something like the shroud on linen, using different frequencies, different durations of exposure, different amplitudes, all strengths, and he couldn't do it. So to this day, they still cannot do it. But they do have theories. And Dr. John Jackson's team, he was from Los Alamos Jet Propulsion Laboratories in the US, and they studied the shroud. And he came up with a theory called vacuum ultraviolet radiation hypothesis, saying that sometime after death, but before the body began to decompose, the body emitted a short, intense burst of light energy that led to the dehydration and discoloration of the shroud, giving this perfect three-dimensional image or photographic negative image on the body. And he also says it was mechanically transparent. So far today, science has no way. Now, the energy would have been amazing, because they say it would have been around 34,000 billion watts of energy for just a nanosecond or two. Otherwise, it would have destroyed the shroud. So they have no idea how this could be done, but it's just amazing to me how it supports everything that we believe in faith for 2,000 years. And the interesting thing is, in the gospel where it says Peter and John, Mary Magdalene came to Peter and John and said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've laid him. And then Peter and John run to the tomb. John arrives first. He waits for Peter. Peter then goes in. John goes in, and he says he saw the linen wrappings lying there. He saw and believed. Well, why would he believe if there were just a bunch of clothes lying in the? He could have thought right away the normal thing to think would be, well, somebody stole the body. But the original language says he saw the linen wrappings lying there, still in their folds, meaning it was not unwrapped, but there was no body there. And he would have seen the image there, and so that was what led him to believe. So science is sort of confirming everything we've believed for the last 2,000 years as Catholics. And it means that our relationship with Jesus is the single most important relationship in our life, because only he can do things for us that nobody else can do. And what he can do is two things. The first thing he can do is he can help us live a holy life, which is not possible for us to do all by ourselves. And I saw that in my own life. I grew up in Oakville, and when I grew up, I was not a Catholic. We were united, belonged to the United Church, but we would go to church maybe Mother's Day and Christmas. That was it. We did not pray at home normally. We did not read the Bible. We did not talk about God or faith. I went to public schools. There was I didn't have any faith growing up. And so as I grew up, what I would like to do more than anything else was I loved playing sports and having fun. And I also wanted to do good in school so that I could get a good job someday and have a good life. That was what my motivation in life was all about. But then when I went to university in Halifax, I had to make a whole new group of friends, and I did. And after about a year, I remember thinking about my friends, thinking, okay, there's Monica, there's Patricia, there's Malcolm, there's Timothy, Arnold, and we've all gotten to be good friends. We go to class together, we talk together, we go to parties together, etc. But they all go to church. And I remember pausing at that thought, thinking, that's so weird. Why did they do that? Because I didn't have any friends doing that growing up. So I asked one of them, and he was a little bit uncomfortable, and he just said, well, you can come along if you want. So I did go along with him to his Pentecostal church a number of times, went with my Catholic friends to Catholic Mass, went back to the United Church, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I guess I was looking for something. And then some months later, one evening, I was studying with a friend of mine. We took a break, and we started talking about life and about religion and God, and she just said something, and at that moment, it was like a light went on inside of me that was not on before, and I just knew and felt the presence of God, and that God was real, and he loved me. I just knew that. I don't know how. It was just a gift, I think. And then from that point on, my life began to change without me even realizing it. And some months later, I began thinking about my life and how it had changed. And I realized, okay, I still like to have fun and play sports, but that's no longer the most important thing to me. What's more important is I really want to do something good for other people. I want to be good and do good for them. Also, I still wanted to try to do good in school, but not so that I could get a job and live a comfortable life, but so that I could find out what God wanted me to do with my life and follow his plan. So that was completely a change. I went from a self-centered life, focusing just on me and what I wanted, to what does God want and how can I live a good life for other people. That was a huge transformation, and it happened so slowly that I didn't even really notice it at the time. So that's one thing Jesus can do for us. And the second thing he can do for us is he's the only one who can get us into heaven. No, we cannot get into heaven on our own. Scripture says that all men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So none of us can get to heaven on our own. However, Jesus says that he is the resurrection and life, and if we have a friendship and relationship with him, he will be the one who can make us worthy to enter heaven. And I just want to end now with a true story that I think helps us to understand that a little better. It happened in the life of Abraham Lincoln. And as you know, he was the president in the U.S. during the Civil War when the North was fighting against the South. And the story is that there was a man and his two sons fighting on the side of the North. And about a year into the war, the father was shot and killed. A few months later, one son was shot and killed. And then the one son remaining realized he's the last man left in the family. So he has to get home to the farm in the Midwest before the snow flies, or his mother and two young sisters might not make it through the harsh winter on their own. But the only person who could give him permission to leave active duty at the time in the middle of a war was the president. So he got permission from his commanding officer to go to the White House and present his case. So when he arrived, he just walked up the steps of the White House and asked to see the president. And he was told that's impossible. He's not seeing ordinary citizens right now. Come back after the war and he'll be happy to see you. So the soldier didn't know what to do, so he just walked down the steps, sat on a bench, thought about his situation, and he began to cry. And after about 5 minutes, he lifted up his head, and there was a little boy standing in front of him, maybe 6 years old, and he asked the soldier, and he said, "Mister, why are you crying so hard?" So the soldier told the boy the story, how he lost his dad, lost his brother. Now he may never see his mother and two sisters again unless he can go home, and only the president can give him permission to do that. But he can't see the president. It's impossible. So to his surprise, the little boy grabbed his hand and said, "Well, come with me." So the little boy led the soldier around the back of the White House, and the servants hanging up the laundry, they saw the little boy holding the soldier's hand. They didn't say anything. The guards at the back of the door, when they saw the little boy coming, holding the soldier's hand, they stepped aside and let him pass. The little boy led the soldier down a long corridor, and there were two wooden doors at the end. And without knocking, he just pushed the doors open and burst into a room. And there was a meeting going on in the room. And in the meeting, there were a number of top generals, the vice president, the secretary of state, and President Abraham Lincoln discussing the war. And when the little boy burst into the room, everybody paused and looked. Nobody said anything. And then when the president stood up and saw the little boy standing there holding the soldier's hand, he just smiled. And he said, "Tad, what can I do for you?" And the little boy said, "Daddy, this soldier needs to talk to you. It's really, really important." So when I heard that, I thought that's exactly what we believe as Christians. You know, the soldier had no chance of seeing the president on his own, but because he allowed the son to befriend him and lead him, he got a favorable welcome. And it's the same with us. None of us can get to heaven on our own, but if we allow Jesus to befriend us and lead us through life, it'll be his friendship with him that will receive a favorable welcome in heaven. And so I think the Shroud of Turin is a great help to our faith, and it can help us to appreciate a little bit more of what Jesus went through out of love for us. And his friendship in our life is the single most important friendship we have, because only he can help us live a holy life, and only he can bring us to the kingdom of heaven one day.